when you look back on it, you can enjoy this or that person's performance, like what voice they used, or the funny line they came up with, or the extravagant thing they had their character did.
Uh-huh.
But can you say it the events of play turned out differently because of the decisions that our characters made? Did the actual content of the events, I mean, the actual procedure of the events, really arise from what we did? And I don't think so. I think that the structure is fixed in such a fashion that the content becomes nothing but enjoyable riffing on it. You are just spinning off, what to do next in this
Uh-huh.
situation, and it is only for it just goes kind of outward toward the unseen audience and doesn't come back into play as a consequence that matters for what someone else says. um, it is now, improvisational theater does involve listening to each other a lot so that you can make connections and glue from what they said to what you say and do. But it doesn't, how am I going to put it? But I don't think we are talking much about um, I don't think we are talking much about what my character does is, for lack of a better word, taken seriously. I mean, it's not taken as a constraint, a situational change. And I could say anything. I could say anything, right? There's no constraint on what my character can or cannot say, can or cannot do, based on what's happened already. I mean, it's I don't know. Am I making any sense at all? Or
Uh, I think so. I think so. Although I wonder how the things that you described are influenced by, I don't have a proper name for it, but I would say freedom of creating a story. So, for example, if I want to say in a game of Fiasco that I go and steal your car, in a different game than Fiasco, I would have to pass a check to open a door, pass a check to disable the alarm, and pass a
not
check
in there's lots
to
of games
boot
in
the
which you wouldn't,
engine.
right? No, there's lots of games where you don't have to do that. Primetime Adventures, you don't. And Primetime Adventures works
Yes,
very well.
yes, yes. And I'm trying to understand how much you are, but these games like Fiasco, like Primetime of Adventures, in order to be able to get anything done, they have to like forego this detailed stuff that is often constrained, as
Right.
you are saying.
Well, let's be careful
Because
about that. The
because
resolution
otherwise,
goals resolution there's such a thing as bad resolution design. If all it does is put speed bumps infinitely in front of your character, that's not a resolution system. That's a shut up system. That's a silencing system. And there are plenty of role playing games in which their resolution systems are nothing but brick walls and pillows that you get buried in. Okay, so don't. So if we're going to be talking about comparing systems, we need to be comparing good systems. We can't talk about a system which is crap. There are plenty of
uh,
games with very powerful resolution methods like you're describing, but they would not put you through that huge set of bullshit in order to go and destroy someone's car.
yeah, but I'm still trying to get your point then, because there is nothing stopping us in a game of Fiasco that if I in one scene burnt your car, but someone else decided that the scene turns out into what I wanted to do. Maybe I wanted to burn your car to be in the newspapers, and someone decides that you succeed, I burned your car, and there's a photo of me doing it in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing stopping you when it's your turn to frame the scene to take this into as a constraint and say that
But you're not taking
maybe
it as a
because
constraint. A constraint means you're constrained by it. A
yes,
constraint means you would have to do it. Not that you have a
yes,
choice to do it. The way you just, because I could not do that. I could just let the car burn and just go and name something new.
Yeah.
Okay, so
yes,
I'm not talking about that. That's, you see, you were talking about freedom to create the story. Freedom is the last thing you want.
Okay.
Freedom is the last thing you want. You need to have authority to do, what you say can happen next, or to do next, or something like that. But whatever constraint comes in, I mean constraint in a very powerful way.
Okay.
It has to be, if it's not a constraint unless it must be taken into account.
Okay, so let's talk. Let's talk about something that does it in a good way.
Sure.
That I can.
Let's go to your apocalypse game world. Your apocalypse world.
Okay.
Let's go straight there because you played it. Mm-hmm. And I am going to say, I think with some confidence, that when somebody had a fairly spectacular failure in that game, that the consequences for the situation as a whole were felt to some extent, perhaps strongly, perhaps weakly, by every other character, because of what the Master of Ceremonies said the situation was like next. Because of that failure, what happens next was now subject to very distinct constraints. And sometimes when you have constraints, your inspiration booms for the thing you can say, right? It's like, maybe it's like squeezing a toothpaste tube, right? Without a good hard squeeze, the toothpaste isn't, I don't know, terrible analogy. But the idea, but the idea is that you have, you had to take into account what occurred. You didn't have a choice. And that's why it's just like in the Holmes game. If the characters went this direction in the dungeon and they took this much damage in this room, then when they go to this room, their situation as a whole, the game master has no choice. They are where they are. And so it's the same thing a little bit with something like, the same thing a lot with something like, I think what I'm hearing in your Apocalypse World game, when the angel, now when I played Apocalypse World, in the most memorable example, one of the other player characters was the angel. So I am well aware of what these fellows can. Hey, I'm just going to play the healer. Oh no, oh no, this cannot go well, right? So that's what I mean. I mean, when that character either makes a spectacular failure on those 2d6 or makes a spectacular success, the world changes a little, right?
Yeah.
Okay? That world changing a little, that's the new constraint, the new thing that, for example, the Master of Ceremonies, as well as anybody else, but especially the Master of Ceremonies, when they say, okay, so now this is how it's going. So I will probably surprise no one by saying that I love playing the Hocus. And one of the fun things about the Hocus is this terrible roll you have to make in every, right, at the beginning of every one of your scenes to see how your flock's doing this time, right? And I had a particularly scuzzy flock. They had all the problems. Gave me all sorts of benefits, but they were a mess, right? My little cult was a mess. So that meant that they were always rolling for some damn thing that they wanted or were upset about or whatever. So much to the MC's, I will say, annoyance in an amused way, okay, in a funny way, much to their annoyance, I kept making that roll.
Mm-hmm.
So my hocus was getting away with more and more and more evangelical social power, feeding this flock of, of very, very questionable characters what they wanted to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And the GM or the MC was saying, if you failed that role, they would have lynched you right there. You know that, right? And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, yes, but that's my point. They were constrained by my successes to have my character's situation be a certain way. And
Mm-hmm.
I was constrained by if my character had rolled a failure for what was to happen. And both of us knew it. This was part of the fabric of play. You can play a hocus much lighter than I played them, right? You can play them more carefully. After a couple of successes on those rolls, I was like, let's see, I'm drunk with power now, let's do this. So,
Mm-hmm.
so what I'm saying in a game like that, you are talking about extraordinarily productive lack of freedom in specific directions. You
Mm-hmm.
don't have the freedom to say, well, I'm role playing your flock and they're going to lynch you now.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have the freedom to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing goes with some of the other consequential, and that's why I liked the angel part that you mentioned, is because I know that when you have an angel in the play, the MC is going to be thrown, a wide variety of these kinds of constraints, which are fun
Mm-hmm.
constraints. They're not telling you what to do, but they're certainly telling you what you can't do.
Mm-hmm.
That's important, I think. Does that help a little bit in terms of what I'm driving at with this principle of what we did in play actually shapes the new situations of play?
Yeah, this really highlights this. This really highlights my enjoyment from the game. But I'm really curious, how can we name what we are talking about? So, in other words, how can we name this thing that blades are lacking that Apocalypse World has? Because I'm missing vocabulary to name this thing so
Sure.
that I know what I'm holding.
Right. Well, I will also say that I will open up anything I've said about Blades in the Dark to those. The dialogue about that is continuing. Okay. It's a
Mm-hmm.
work in progress. I'm
Okay.
presenting one of the more negative views that goes into that dialogue rather than, my pronouncement about Blades in the Dark. So,
You can try, but whoever watches this video will
I
say,
know,
Ron said Blades is a
I
bad
know,
game.
I know, I know. What can you do? The dialogue, for anyone who's interested, the dialogue is in progress. So, with lots of people who've played it. So, with that in mind,
Mm-hmm.
we have this issue of naming. Okay. Um, First of all, we are talking about one of the procedures of play, which is called situational authority, which is
Mm-hmm.
effective, which has many things in it, but one of its primary things is where are we looking next?
Mm-hmm.
Where is our attention next? In a game like the Holmes D&D, it's when you get the door open. Sometimes it's the
Mm-hmm.
door itself, but let's pretend that we're not doing that. I get a little tired
Mm-hmm.
of doors, frankly. Why does every door in a
Yeah.
dungeon have to be a committee meeting? So let's
Mm-hmm.
just say most of the doors are not a pain in the ass. So I'm going to talk now about opening the door. What do we see? That's a new
Mm-hmm.
situation. It's a new situation of play. The game master pulls out a new map. What more do you need to know that we're in a new situation? And as we talked about before, there is not a bit of difference between what I just said and the word scene.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you are playing scenes in every role-playing game. Let's
Mm-hmm.
just get over that right now. So when we have that moment, and for example, in Apocalypse World, where I could be wrong about this, but it has something to do with having kind of cycled around the characters this time,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you've got to kind of looked at what each one has gotten up to. Sometimes they were in the same place, sometimes they weren't, but you kind of, the same thing with
Mm-hmm.
Primetime Adventures and Troll Babe and a number of others. There's sort of a unit of play, which is sort of a look at what everybody has gotten up to lately, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
there's enough content there for somebody to say, in the game master in Trollbabe, for example, to say, okay, so next morning, ...
Mm-hmm.
Next morning, the chief is really pissed off, and he took his favorite warriors, and he went off into the mountains, and you don't know where.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's what the chief did this morning. So, but instead of making that up from nothing, the game master was looking at what had happened across all those situations and is going, oh, well, of course the chief has to go off and awaken the bear spirit.